My name is Margaret Chin. I'm 44 years old. I spent 18 years in U.S. Army intelligence, most of them intercepting and decoding communications in secure facilities where sunlight was a luxury. I can distinguish a native Beijing dialect from a carefully constructed imitation within seconds of listening. But nothing in my training prepared me for what unfolded at my father's wedding. It was meant to be intimate. A small gathering, second chances, close friends only. The venue was decorated with ivory roses and soft candlelight. My 12-year-old daughter, Emma, sat beside me, her dress carefully pressed, clutching something concealed in her pocket. I hadn't questioned what it was. When the officiant reached that ceremonial phrase about objections, I expected nothing. No one ever speaks up. It's merely tradition, a formality. But Emma stood. She walked forward, past rows of bewildered guests, and stopped directly in front of my father. She pulled out a small recording device and held it with both hands as if it were something sacred. "Grandfather," her voice was steady but quiet. "Please don't marry her." Gasps rippled through the room. Emma looked at my father, then continued. "I found this hidden in your study. Behind the tax documents." My father, David Chen, retired Army physician, silver-haired and dignified, chuckled awkwardly. "Sweetheart, this really isn't the time for games." But Emma pressed the button. A woman's voice emerged from the device, cold and precise, speaking Mandarin. "He's already signed everything. After the ceremony, we have 72 hours to complete the transfer. The military daughter will be dealt with separately." The bride froze. Guests exchanged confused glances. My father turned to me, face draining of color. "What? What did she just say?" I understood every syllable. My blood ran cold. She wasn't speaking hypothetically. She was speaking about me. I didn't respond verbally. I reached into my bag, retrieved my phone, and tapped. A contact marked only with a red flag. One silent call. No words exchanged, just a signal. I returned the phone to my bag. 8 minutes. That's all it would take. Behind me, confused murmuring grew louder. Natalia, the bride, attempted to laugh it off. "This is ridiculous. That's not even my voice. Someone's playing a prank." But my father wasn't laughing anymore. He stared at her with completely different eyes. Emma had stepped back to my side, and I took her hand. The music had stopped. The silence felt heavier than anything I'd experienced in combat zones. Exactly 8 minutes later, 4 individuals entered the chapel. Professional attire, credentials visible, moving with quiet authority. FBI. International Division. One of them spoke briefly to the officiant, then turned toward us. No drama, no hesitation. They walked directly to the bride. And everything that followed changed not just the wedding, but the trajectory of our entire lives. I hadn't expected my daughter to stop a wedding. I hadn't expected the woman my father loved to be part of an international fraud operation. And I hadn't expected that nearly 2 decades of intelligence work would come crashing into my personal life during what should have been a celebration. But that's how truth works. It waits for the most visible moment to reveal itself. Let me go back. The beginning. After my mother passed, my father changed. The man who used to restore vintage motorcycles and collect first edition mysteries suddenly stopped planning for tomorrow. He sold the family home, moved into a smaller condo, and stopped smiling with his whole face. Then came Natalia. He met her at a grief support group for military families. She was elegant, seemingly younger than her years, with a carefully crafted backstory. Lost her family in Ukraine, worked through nursing school alone, spoke 5 languages fluently, played classical violin. Too perfect. The first time we met, she complimented Emma's bracelet in flawless English. Then she offered her water, calling it voda in Russian. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't notice. But her pronunciation, her intonation, it wasn't Ukrainian. It wasn't even Eastern European standard. It was Moscow-educated, sharp, buried under practiced warmth. I didn't mention it then. Instead, I started observing. She never slipped again. Her accent remained consistent, her charm constant. My father was completely enchanted. He came alive when she entered a room. For the first time since Mom died, he seemed hopeful again. I wanted to believe it was genuine. I wanted Emma to see her grandfather happy again. So I waited. Until the morning Emma found the device. She came into my room, eyes wide, lips pressed tight. "I think it's hers," she said, holding out the small recorder. It was hidden in Grandpa's desk, way in the back. I pressed play. The audio was fragmented at first, just pieces. But the voice was unmistakably Mandarin Chinese. One phrase repeated clearly, "After the wedding, we move quickly." I looked at Emma. "I'll handle this," I said. But she didn't believe me. And perhaps she shouldn't have, because I hesitated. Not because I didn't trust what we'd found, but because my father needed to see it for himself. If I intervened too early, he would dismiss it as paranoia, old habits, overprotectiveness. I had no concrete proof yet, just instinct. So I waited. But Emma didn't. That morning before the wedding, she asked me again if we were going to stop it. I said, "Not yet." She nodded as if she understood, but she tucked the recorder into her pocket anyway. And when the moment arrived, when the officiant spoke that line "No one ever interrupts," Emma made the decision I was too cautious to make. She stood up. She revealed the truth. And I listened. I let the weight of it settle before I acted. I gave the enemy space to expose herself, because when Natalia laughed it off, when she called it a prank, she revealed what evidence alone couldn't capture: arrogance. And that's all I needed. So I made the quiet call. Not to local police, but to federal authorities, because I knew this wasn't just personal betrayal. It was something larger, more calculated. I'd seen this pattern before during my years in intelligence. The charming widow, the language inconsistencies, the identity that never appears in any legitimate database. And when the agents arrived, calm and coordinated, I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel vindication. I felt something deeper: relief. Not because I was right, but because Emma wouldn't be left wondering whether she'd done the wrong thing. She would know. And so would everyone else in that chapel. This wasn't just a disrupted wedding. It was a moment when truth didn't need to shout. It just needed to be heard. The unraveling. After my mother passed away, my father became a quieter version of himself. Not broken, not bitter, just diminished. He stopped playing music in the mornings. He stopped fixing the antique clock that ran 5 minutes slow. He sold the house they'd built together, claiming it was too large. He moved into a smaller place near the coast, where the mail arrived late and neighbors kept to themselves. It was like watching a light dim gradually. Not sudden darkness, just less and less brightness. Then came Natalia. She entered quietly, almost imperceptibly, until you realized the silence had been replaced. He met her at a support hike for bereaved veterans. I remember when he told me. We were sitting on his balcony, sharing lukewarm coffee. He mentioned her casually, like describing someone he'd met. Tea in passing. She noticed I was struggling with my hiking boots, he said. Offered to help. I told her I'd been tying military boots since before she was born. Then he smiled. A genuine one, the kind that reached his eyes. I hadn't seen that smile in nearly 4 years. Her name was Natalia Volkov. Born in Ukraine, she claimed, immigrated after nursing school. Her English was impeccable, fluent but gentle, with something Eastern European in the vowels. She started appearing more frequently in his life. First in background photos, then at family brunches. Then she brought homemade pierogi to Emma's birthday. My father changed. He started dressing more carefully. He bought a new sound system and filled it with Russian classical composers, Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, Shostakovich. He even joined a community gardening class. He said it made him feel useful again. Emma didn't know what to make of it. She was 12, old enough to notice patterns, too young to articulate them. "Is Grandpa getting married?" she asked one evening. "Maybe," I said, folding laundry. "She makes him happy." Emma frowned. "She talks strange." "She's from another country." "No, not like that. I mean, she says things in weird ways. Like she's trying to sound nice, but she's actually watching everything." That made me pause. "Just listen carefully," I told her. "Don't react too quickly. Just observe." She nodded, but I could see her shoulders tense. Emma had inherited my instincts. She picked up on energy before words. And honestly, I was starting to feel the same way. It wasn't that Natalia did anything obviously wrong. That was the problem. She did everything impeccably. She complimented my father's wine selections. She offered to help with cleanup before meals were finished. She called Emma sweetheart but never tried too hard. It was polished, seamless, too seamless. One evening, she and I were alone in the kitchen while dishes soaked. Emma was upstairs with homework. My father had gone out for dessert. She handed me a glass of red wine. "You must worry constantly," she said softly. I raised an eyebrow. "About what?" She tilted her head. "About your father. About Emma. About people's intentions." There was no accusation in her tone, just observation. I took a sip. "I used to work in intelligence. Old habits." She smiled. "I understand. I worked in hospitals. I look at people's hands first. You look at their eyes." She turned to rinse a plate. And I remember thinking that response was too smooth, too quick to establish common ground, too rehearsed. Still, I said nothing, because even if something felt wrong, she was making my father laugh again. And that was something no one else had accomplished in years. But then there were the words. The tiny, quick inconsistencies. Like when she reached for water and called it Voda, the Russian word, not Ukraine. Ian. Or when she mentioned visiting the motherland without specifying which one. It wasn't enough to confront her with. Not yet. But enough to keep paying attention. One afternoon, I found her humming a Soviet-era lullaby in the kitchen. When she noticed me, she switched to a jazz tune. That night, I searched her name through every database I still had access to. There were hits, some public, some restricted, but none conclusive. Still, I didn't warn my father. Because sometimes love makes people see only what they need. And I didn't want to be the soldier who took hope away from a man who had already lost so much. So I watched. I waited. I stayed still. But Emma didn't. And in the end, she was the one who saw what I almost missed, because Natalia hadn't just entered our lives randomly. She'd studied us first. And that was when I stopped smiling too. The engagement. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. My father's voice was steadier than usual. "Margaret," he said. "I've decided to marry Natalia." I didn't flinch, didn't question. Just sat in my car outside the supermarket and said, "Okay." There was a pause long enough to feel his anticipation through the line. "Okay," he echoed. "I mean it," I said. "You deserve happiness." And I did mean that, mostly. But the tightness in my chest didn't ease. It stayed, like pressure building quietly inward. They set the date for early summer. A garden ceremony, small, private, elegant. I offered to help, but Natalia had already managed most arrangements. She was efficient, always 2 steps ahead. That's when things accelerated. She began moving things into his home. Not just personal items, but documents, insurance files, investment folders, utility accounts. At first, it appeared like normal life merging. But when I visited one afternoon to help with printer issues, I noticed something concerning. Life insurance paperwork sat openly on his desk. The coverage had been modified recently. The original beneficiary was listed as Emma Chen, granddaughter. Now it had been replaced with Natalia Volkov, fiancé. There was a handwritten note from the insurance advisor confirming the beneficiary change and the doubling of the policy value. It was signed and dated from the previous week. I sat back in his desk chair, leather creaking softly beneath me. I didn't touch anything, didn't photograph it. I just read it twice, let the numbers settle in my mind, and walked out. It wasn't only the insurance. My father's savings account, once substantial and rarely accessed, had begun showing consistent withdrawals. Small enough not to alarm him directly. Regular enough to concern me. I asked him casually over Luan. Are you renovating something? No, he replied, chewing slowly. Why? Just noticed you've been to the bank more often. He smiled somewhat sheepishly. Natalia's helping with wedding expenses. I told her she could handle vendor payments directly. She's better at that than I am. I nodded. You trust her? With my life, he said. That was when I stopped eating, because love may be blind, but trust is deaf. At home, Emma had gone quiet. She used to joke about Grandpa's new lady, calling her Miss Russia with a grin. But lately, she'd withdrawn. When Natalia arrived with my father for dinner one evening, Emma disappeared into her room and pretended to sleep through the meal. After they left, I went to check on her. She stared at the ceiling and said, "Why do people change when someone smiles at them?" I sat on the edge of the bed. What do you mean? Grandpa used to laugh at dumb jokes. Now he just stares at her. Maybe she makes him feel seen. Emma shook her head. She doesn't even like his jokes. Then she rolled over, pulling the covers tight. She didn't say anything more, but I stayed there for a while, long enough to hear her breathing soften into sleep. That night, I walked into my office, locked the door, and opened a secure drive I hadn't accessed in years. It was time to stop feeling and start analyzing. I ran Natalia's name through several public registries. Nothing appeared problematic. No criminal record, no financial red flags. Her address history matched what she'd told us. She had a valid nursing license, active in 3 states. But the background was too clean. People carry imperfections, gaps, inconsistencies. Hers was polished, wrapped perfectly. I went deeper, used an old contact in military intelligence to cross-reference name variations, middle names, maiden names. No obvious matches, but a flag appeared on an encrypted bulletin used for international fraud alerts. A reference to a suspected Russian national with forged Ukrainian documents. Female, early 40s, often targeting widowed male veterans in Europe and Canada. No arrests, just a trail of vanishing assets. The operational code name attached was Zoya. I leaned back, staring at the name. Zoya. I didn't know if it was her. I couldn't prove it. But the pattern was forming, taking shape. I remembered something my old commanding officer used to say, if a pattern's too neat, it's because someone designed it that way. I told no one. Not yet. Because suspicions without evidence are just noise, and noise only obscures truth. Instead, I waited, watched. And my daughter did the same. One evening, I came home and found Emma bent over my father's desk. She had a small device in her hand, one of those novelty spy gadgets from toy stores. She looked up, startled. I wasn't breaking anything, she said. I just thought maybe. I raised an eyebrow. Maybe what? She hesitated. She talks different when no one's around. She held up the device. I just wanted to know what she really says. My heart clenched. I should have stopped her. Told her it wasn't her responsibility. But I didn't. Instead, I knelt down and looked her in the eye. Then you listen carefully. But don't judge prematurely. Understand? She nodded, serious beyond her years. And that's when I realized something profound. The only reason Natalia hadn't fooled all of us was because my 12-year-old daughter refused to stop paying attention. The recording. It was a rainy Tuesday when Emma came into my room without knocking. She held something small in her hand, closed in her fist like a fragile creature. I sat up straight, instinct activating before reason could catch up. "Where did you get that?" I asked, calm but firm. She opened her hand slowly. It was a small voice recorder, inexpensive but functional, with a single button and a cracked screen. I recognized it. My father kept a few in his study for dictating notes when he still preferred paper to screens. "I found it in Grandpa's desk," Emma said. "In the back drawer, hidden under old envelopes." My first reaction was protective. Not about the device. About Emma. "Did he see you take it?" She shook her head. "He was watering plants." "She was with him." She didn't have to specify. "Natalia." I reached for the device and examined it. The recording media was still inside, slightly worn. I looked at her. "Did you listen?" She hesitated, then nodded. "A little." "How much is a little?" I stopped when I heard Mandarin. "I thought you should hear it first." That stopped me cold. "Mandarin?" She nodded again, slower this time. "Not much, just a few words." But it didn't sound like she was reading poetry. I connected the device to my laptop using an adapter I hadn't touched since 2014. The software was outdated, but it loaded. I scrubbed through static, then heard it. A woman's voice, controlled, precise. Mandarin accent, native, from the eastern regions if I had to pinpoint it. The first section was fragmented, but then it clarified. "After the wedding, we have 72 hours to secure the transfer. I will handle the old soldier's daughter if she interferes." Then silence, a thump, as if the device had been dropped or someone entered the room. The audio stopped abruptly. I stared at the screen, then at Emma. She sat on the edge of my chair, lips pressed into a thin line. "Do you know what she said?" she asked. "I do," I answered. I didn't elaborate. "Not yet. Because the worst thing you can do to a child is give them a truth they can't process." "She's not who she says she is she?" Emma asked, almost whispering. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I turned off the screen and wrapped my hand around the recorder. "We don't say it. Hing to Grandpa." "Not yet. But he's going to marry her." "I know," I said. "And we're going to let him, for now." Emma looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Why would we let him marry someone dangerous?" I paused, weighing my next words carefully. "Because if we stop him now, she disappears before we can prove anything. And then she'll just target someone else. And maybe next time, no one will be watching." She went quiet, then asked, "So we wait?" "We wait," I confirmed. "But we don't stop listening." Over the following days, we became shadows in our own lives. I coached Emma quietly on how to observe without reacting. It wasn't just for her benefit. It was how I'd been trained years ago, when surveillance meant more than technology. It meant instinct, silence, trusting your observations but not acting until the moment was right. She was naturally skilled at it. At dinner one evening, Natalia told a story about her cousin's wedding outside St. Petersburg, slipping in architectural details so specific that even my father looked surprised. "Have you been back recently?" he asked. She smiled. "Not since the pandemic, but I remember it perfectly." Then she turned to me. "You've been to Russia, haven't you, Margaret?" She always used my full name. Never Maggie, never Marg, just Margaret. I nodded. "Only briefly." "Estonian border region." Her eyes flickered momentarily. Then she smiled. "Ah, Narva." I returned the smile. "Silami, actually." She paused, wine glass midair. Silami wasn't a tourist destination. It was a former Soviet uranium processing site. I saw the tiniest calculation ripple across her face before she recovered. You must have been with a humanitarian organization. I was with the army, I said. Signals intelligence. My father chuckled, missing the tension entirely. Don't let her fool you, Natalia. My daughter's fluent in 3 languages and can break down a communications tower with a wrench and determination. Natalia smiled at him, but I watched her fingers curl slightly around her fork. That was the first time I knew she feared me. And that meant we were finally making progress. But I also knew the recording wasn't sufficient. It wasn't complete. It didn't name accounts. It didn't name contacts. It didn't even reference my father directly. Just the wedding. Just the vague threat toward me. Enough to raise suspicion. Not enough to hold up in any formal proceeding. That night, Emma knocked on my door again. I think we missed something, she said, climbing up beside me on the couch. I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? She held up a spiral-bound notebook. It was one of my father's gardening logs. He kept them religiously, cataloging which orchids bloomed when and under what conditions. Emma opened to a page near the back. She wrote something in here, she said. In pencil, then erased it. But if you angle it under light, look. She held it beneath the lamp. I leaned in. Sure enough, indentations. Mandarin characters in cursive script. I read slowly, translating aloud, Zoya. Monday. Confirm. Attorney. Swiss account access confirmed. Use credentials from Riga Hotel. My throat constricted. Zoya. The same alias from the fraud alert database. And a Swiss account. An attorney. Emma looked up at me. Is it her? I nodded. It's her. But we still needed more substantial evidence. Don't confront her, I told her. No matter what happens. She looked hurt. I'm not a child. I touched her shoulder. No, you're not. That's why I'm trusting you with this. She looked down, then back up. I'll wait. But can I keep the recorder? Just until after the wedding? I hesitated, then handed it back. You press that button only when it matters most. She nodded once. I'll know when. And that was the moment I stopped worrying about whether Emma could handle the truth. She already was handling it. The observation. I should have known Emma wouldn't remain passive for long. She had always been perceptive, but now that perception had sharpened into something else, vigilance that didn't quite belong to a 12-year-old. It concerned me, not because she was wrong, but because she was so determined to be right. 3 days after we reviewed the recording, Emma came home from school and went straight to the kitchen window. From there, she had a perfect view of the garden path and the back patio where Natalia liked to make her calls. I watched from the doorway as she crouched behind the curtain, notebook in hand. Homework? I asked casually. She didn't even flinch. In a minute. She's out there now. She who? She glanced up at me, deadpan. Her. I walked over and knelt beside her. Sure enough, Natalia stood outside in her elegant coat, a scarf around her neck despite the warm weather. Her phone was pressed tightly to her ear. Her lips moved quickly, too quickly for casual English. I slid the window open just slightly. Sergey, she said, then switched to Russian. Her tone was clipped, urgent. I caught fragments, account. Monday. Secondary identity. And then, she's suspicious. My blood turned cold. Emma scribbled in her notebook, documenting the time, the date, what Natalia wore, how long the call lasted. It was methodical, clinical, more structured than some briefings I used to read. She said his name again, she whispered to me. Sergey. Same as from the notebook. I nodded, gently pulling the curtain back. How often does she come out here? Every day, she said. Between 4 and 5. You've been watching that long? She gave a half shrug. Since you told me to observe, I did. There was no pride in her voice, no brag. Jing, just fact. That night, after she went to bed, I took the notebook into my room and examined it for hours. There were pages upon pages of details, timestamps, overheard phrases, diagrams of where people stood. She had even mapped the backyard layout, noting how sound carried depending on wind direction. One note stood out, 4:43 p.m. She said, if he sees the documents before the 14th, we're finished. Then laughed. It was dated 2 days ago. I closed the notebook and stared at the ceiling. I'd been careful not to make her feel like she was part of something dangerous. But she was. And she knew it. Worse, she was acting like she had to solve it herself. The next morning, she slipped the notebook into my bag before I could say anything. I looked at her. You want me to take this? She nodded. In case something happens. Emma. I'm not scared, Mom. But you should have it. There was a new hardness in her eyes, something that didn't belong to a child. Later that day, I sat with my father on the patio while he pruned roses. He looked lighter lately, relaxed, as if shadows had stopped advancing for just a moment. Natalia was inside, baking something that smelled like cinnamon and concealment. Dad, I said carefully. Do you ever worry she's too perfect? He laughed. That's the problem, isn't it? You spend enough years with grief, and when happiness shows up, it feels suspicious. She didn't come from nowhere, he continued, clipping a stem. She showed up in my hiking group. Started with a twisted ankle, ended with Russian pastries and blooming orchids. I wanted to shout. Not because he wasn't listening, but because I knew he was. He just didn't want to believe what he was hearing. That night, Emma came to me again. She didn't have the recorder this time, just a look in her eyes. If we don't do something, she said, he's going to lose everything. His money, his house. Us. Emma, it's not that simple. Yes, it is. She gripped the edge of the table. She's lying. And I think he knows. He just doesn't want to say it. Her voice cracked. I saw her burning papers in the fire pit this morning. I froze. What kind of papers? I don't know. But she looked over her shoulder twice, like she thought someone was watching. Were you? She nodded once. I felt a mixture of terror and admiration. She wasn't just watching anymore. She was tracking Natalia like a field operative. I leaned in. Emma, listen very carefully. I don't want you near her unless I'm there. Understand? She hesitated, then nodded. I mean it. Not even to listen. Not even to watch. From now on, your job is to tell me. That's it. Her eyes brimmed. But what if? No, what if? You've done enough. More than enough. I held her shoulders. You are not responsible for what happens next. That's my job. But I started it, she whispered. No, I said. You saw what most people miss. That's not starting trouble. That's seeing truth. She looked down. She scares me. I pulled her into an embrace. She should. That means your instincts are working. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat beside her bed and stared out the window. Natalia was in the garden again. But this time she wasn't on the phone. She was staring straight at the house. I couldn't prove it, but I knew she was looking at Emma's window. And I knew right then I couldn't wait much longer. The wedding day. The music had stopped mid-phrase. All eyes were on Emma as she stood at the front of the aisle, holding that small black recorder as if it were explosive. And in a way, it was. Grandfather, she repeated, her voice shaking but clear. Don't marry her. I found this in your office. She pressed the button. A click, then static. Then the voice that emerged wasn't familiar to anyone in the room except me. a woman's voice, crisp, cold, calculated, speaking Mandarin. We have 72 hours after the ceremony to transfer the funds. I'll handle the military woman if she interferes. The recording cut off. Stunned silence followed. Guests froze mid-breath. Someone dropped a glass. I heard it shatter in the background like punctuation to an unspoken sentence. I didn't move. Neither did Natalia. My daughter had just detonated the truth. I was Margaret Chen, 44, former military intelligence specialist in Chinese signal interception. I'd spent years learning to detect what others miss, the tone beneath words, the truth behind silence. And at that moment, it was silent enough to hear every heartbeat in the chapel. My father turned toward me slowly. What did she say? His voice cracked around the edges. I didn't answer with words. I didn't have to, because in that instant, he understood. Not the specifics, not the details, but he understood that whatever Emma had just played, I comprehended it completely. Every single word. He looked into my eyes. I didn't look away. I reached into my bag, slid my fingers across the slim device, and tapped the screen once. A silent signal, pre-coded, pre-authorized. A protocol from older days, still embedded in my reflexes. I didn't say anything. I didn't stand. I didn't confront, because the moment you speak, they have something to counter. But silence is terrifying. And Natalia felt it. I saw her breathing quicken. Her eyes flicked between me and the door, between me and Emma, between me and her handbag. She expected yelling, accusation, drama. She wasn't prepared for stillness. That's when her expression changed. It didn't crumble. Not yet. But the corners of her perfect composure twitched. Her lips tightened into a barely perceptible line. Her fingers curled against her dress. She knew she wasn't facing a jealous daughter anymore. She was facing a soldier who'd gone silent. Emma looked back at me, uncertain now, as if realizing the magnitude of what she'd done. I gave her a single nod. That was all she needed. My father was trembling. He didn't yell at Emma. He didn't look at Natalia. He just sat down slowly, as if his knees couldn't carry what his heart had just learned. Margaret, he murmured again. What was that? I still didn't speak. Instead, I stood up and walked forward. Not to the altar, not to Natalia, but to Emma. I placed a hand gently on her shoulder. You did well, I whispered. She looked up at me, lip trembling. Is she going to hurt you? Not anymore. Behind us, someone in the back murmured, Is this part of the ceremony? A nervous laugh tried to emerge. It died in the silence. And then the doors opened. 3 men and 1 woman stepped inside. Not in formal attire, not in celebration clothes. Dark professional suits, subtle credentials at lapels, eyes that scanned like surveillance equipment. FBI. International Division. Natalia stood frozen. She didn't run, that would have been foolish. She didn't scream, that would have been pointless. She did something far worse. She smiled. It was a slow, calculated expression, like someone closing a book they'd already finished. Well, she said in flawless English. I suppose this was inevitable. The officers approached. One spoke into a small mic on his wrist. Another reached gently for her handbag. She didn't resist, didn't flinch. She looked at my father as they restrained her. And then she spoke in Russian. You're not as foolish as I thought, she said, nodding toward me. But your heart will always be your weakness. My father blinked, confused. I responded in the same language, voice low but steady. Your mistake was thinking I'd stay silent. She was escorted out, head held high. But I recognized the look in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of arrest. She was afraid of exposure, of the network coming to light, of the trail she thought buried suddenly uncovered by a 12-year-old and her mother who knew how to listen. Once the doors closed behind them, murmurs erupted. My father stood slowly, face pale. He turned to me. How long? I didn't answer, because the truth wasn't about duration. It was about instinct. And that instinct had just saved his life. The aftermath. They didn't arrive with sirens or drawn weapons. That would have caused panic. They came as if they belonged, four plainclothes officers from the FBI's International Operations Division, moving with silent precision, coordinated purpose. I recognized two of them from my years abroad. The third and fourth I didn't know, but they all moved the same way, controlled, unfazed, like professionals who'd identified their target long before entering. The guests instinctively parted, uncertain whether to remain seated or leave. Whispers grew rapidly. Is this a prank? Is this legal? Who contacted them? I stayed where I was, hand still resting on Emma's shoulder. My daughter leaned closer, heart racing, but her eyes remained locked on Natalia. No. Irina. Because that was her real name. The lead officer walked straight to her without acknowledging anyone else. He retrieved a slim leather folder, opened it to reveal credentials and a photograph. Irina Valenko, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. You are under arrest for transnational fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to exploit elder estates across 4 jurisdictions. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, no. My father gasped. She didn't deny it. Didn't scream. Didn't attempt confusion. She just looked at him, at David Chen, my father, and said with a trace of that carefully buried Russian accent, "You were the easiest one." The air was sucked from the room. Several guests audibly gasped. My aunt clutched her necklace as if that could prevent her from hearing more. The officers didn't wait. One secured her wrists behind her back. Another retrieved a USB drive from her handbag. The third officer, tall and silent, simply observed, eyes never leaving her face. My father took a step backward, stumbling. I moved instantly to support him, one arm under his shoulder. His breathing was ragged. This isn't real. I lowered my voice. Dad, it's real. Her name isn't Natalia. She's wanted in at least 3 countries. And Emma was the one who gave us the evidence. I thought that last part might provide him some grounding, some pride. It didn't. He stared straight ahead, not at Irina now, but at the memory of her. Every dinner, every smile, every hand she'd placed over his. She said she loved me, he whispered. She said a lot of things, I replied gently. Irina turned back just once as they began escorting her toward the door. To be fair, she said in Russian, her voice cruelly casual, I only needed you to believe it. My father flinched as if struck. I responded, also in Russian, flat and cold. Your mistake wasn't the deception. It was underestimating a child who listens. The guests were frozen. Some were already recording discreetly, phones angled low. Others simply sat in stunned silence, unwilling to process the shattering of an illusion they'd all believed. As the officers passed me, one nodded slightly in acknowledgement. I nodded back. Nothing more needed to be said. Once the doors closed, it was as if the room deflated. The music had long stopped. The flowers, once fresh and fragrant, now felt artificial. The chandelier flickered slightly overhead. My father sat back down. He didn't look at anyone, just stared at the space where Irina had stood, as if trying to replay a scene he now knew was fabricated. I knelt beside him. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, I said, voice quiet and level. He didn't answer immediately, just kept shaking his head, whispering to himself. God. Oh God. He looked up finally, his eyes meeting mine. Did you know all along? I shook my head. I had suspicions, but nothing concrete. Not until Emma found the recorder. His face broke. My granddaughter saw what I couldn't. There was shame in his voice, a kind of grief no one had prepared him for. Not over the woman, but over himself, over what he'd allowed to happen. She said all the right things, he muttered. She cooked the food I liked, read the books I loved. She even bought me that old Tchaikovsky record I'd mentioned once. How did she know that? She researched you, I said, calm but firm. The way any professional does. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. I thought after your mother, I thought I was finished. And then this woman enters, makes me laugh again, makes me feel needed. I was ready to give her everything. And that's exactly what she wanted. He looked at me then, a flicker of anger and pain. Why didn't you tell me everything the moment you suspected? Because you were in love, I said. And when someone's in love, they don't hear logic. They don't see facts. They only see hope. I paused, then added gently, and because she was dangerous. If she'd known you were warned, it might have made things worse. For you. For Emma. He exhaled sharply, closed his eyes. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally, in a quiet voice, I don't know how to come back from this. I sat beside him. Not to fix it, not to offer hollow comfort, but to be present. You don't need to come back, I said. You just need to come through. And slowly, he nodded. Broken, but not alone. The reactions. People didn't leave all at once. They lingered, uncertain, unsettled, as if hoping someone would stand up and announce, that was rehearsal. The real wedding starts now. But no one did. The reception was never announced. The catering remained untouched. Even the cake, a 3-tier masterpiece with almond fondant, stood like a frozen monument to everything we hadn't said sooner. Some guests huddled together, constructing their own narratives. Others gave Emma long, thoughtful looks, not of blame exactly, but the kind adults give when a child becomes the messenger for something no one else had the courage to reveal. I saw 2 of my father's colleagues debating in low tones near the piano. One of them, a man named Robert, retired Navy aviator, sharp-minded and deeply loyal, approached me. His tie was still neatly tied, his posture straight, but his eyes were soft with concern. Margaret, he said, almost gently. You knew? I met his gaze. Not everything. But enough. He frowned. Then why didn't you stop it? I breathed in slowly, weighing how much truth he was actually seeking. Because he wouldn't have believed me, I said. Not then. Robert's face pinched. He might have. I shook my head. He was in love, Robert. He wasn't processing logic. If I'd come forward, he would have thought I was jealous or grieving or bitter. Robert opened high. Mouth to object, but then paused. He knew I was right. And Emma, he asked. How did that child end up being the one to act? I looked across the room at my daughter, who sat on the floor by the hallway, knees tucked under her arms, still alert, still watchful. Because she saw what adults refused to see, I said. And she trusted what she heard. Robert exhaled and placed a hand on my shoulder. You raised a remarkable one. I nodded once. I tried to raise someone who listens. He offered a small, respectful nod, then returned to his circle of old friends. I knew they'd continue talking, turning it over, trying to find a narrative that made more sense than what they'd just witnessed. Others weren't so generous. A woman I barely knew, my father's former neighbor, I think, murmured loudly as she passed me, honestly, this feels orchestrated. She waited until the last minute to play hero. Why not speak up earlier? Another guest, more openly critical, looked me up and down and said, it's cruel to let a man propose marriage just to humiliate him in front of everyone. I didn't respond to her. Some people don't want answers. They want someone to blame. But the one that affected me most was a quiet man in his 70s. He was a friend of my father's from his early teaching days. I remembered him from childhood visits. He used to bring chess sets and speak in literary quotes. He came up beside me and asked simply, why now? There was no hostility in his tone. Just pain. The kind that comes from seeing your friend collapse after believing in someone who never existed. I gave him the only answer that ever mattered, because she had to reveal herself, not me. He didn't nod, didn't blink. You knew he wouldn't believe you, he said, not as a question, but as recognition. He needed the truth to come from her actions, I said softly. Or he would have rejected it. There was a pause. Then he said, I think he still might. And he walked away. That's what moments like this do. They divide people into those who want to face truth and those who prefer a comfortable illusion, even if it's shattered. Half the guests departed dazed, their opinions shifting by the minute. The other half stayed behind to find someone to judge. Emma eventually stood and came over to me. Her eyes weren't tearful, but they weren't proud either. Did I do the wrong thing? She asked. My hand reached for hers without hesitation. No, I said. You did the hard thing. And that's not the same. She looked down, then said, some people hate me now. They don't, I replied. They hate that a child did what they couldn't. She nodded slowly, but the words didn't soothe her. That night, in the silence that followed what should have been a celebration, I thought of every time I had restrained myself over the past months. Every time I'd wanted to say, something's wrong. This woman is not who she claims to be. But I stayed silent. Not out of fear. Out of precision. Out of necessity. Because sometimes truth delivered too soon just bounces off walls. It had to come from the source. And today it did. Not with anger, not with vengeance. Just a voice on a recording, and a child brave enough to press play. The quiet after. The house was quieter now. My father had moved into the guest suite attached to mine, closer than I ever thought he'd want to be. But he hadn't resisted when I offered. He just nodded, picked up a single duffel bag, and walked toward the car without another word. It had been 3 weeks since the wedding that wasn't. Since the FBI took Irina Valenko away in a car so ordinary it made the moment feel even more surreal. Since guests stumbled out half whispering, half judging. Since Emma stopped asking me every night whether she'd done the right thing. It had been 3 weeks of quiet evenings. My father hadn't discussed it once. Until tonight. He came in without knocking, he never did anymore, and poured himself a small glass of water. He leaned on the counter, looking older than I ever remembered. Not tired, just aged. His hands rested on the counter as if waiting for permission to speak. I set down the dish towel and nodded wordlessly. He looked at me and said, "You knew." I didn't reply, just gave him space to continue. His voice was low. How long? There was no accusation in his tone, only the kind of bewildered sadness you don't bother disguising with pride anymore. I dried my hands, turned to face him fully. Since the hiking group. He blinked. That early? I nodded. She introduced herself as a grief counselor. But she never asked me anything about Mom. Not once. Just told stories, half about herself, half about Russia. He sat down at the kitchen table, glass in hand. But that could have just been her way of processing grief. Yes, I said gently. It could have. He waited a moment before asking, so when did it stop being just a feeling? I leaned against the sink. The first time she corrected Emma's pronunciation of a Ukrainian phrase. He looked confused. She claimed to have studied in Kiev, I said, but she mixed up 2 simple words in a way no fluent speaker ever would. His eyes dropped to the table. You never told me. No, I said quietly. Why? I poured myself a cup of tea, let the silence stretch, because some answers need a moment to settle before they land. Then I said, because if I had told you then, you would have defended her. You would have thought I was jealous or overly protective or still grieving Mom. He didn't deny it. Instead, he looked at the steam rising from my cup and asked, so you waited for what? For her to expose herself? No, I said calmly. I waited for her to reveal herself to you, not to me. He let out a long breath. And she did. I nodded once. He looked up again. And Emma, she found the recorder. She did, I said. She connected the dots. I warned her to stay back, but she wouldn't. He closed his eyes. God. My granddaughter had to unmask my fiancé. No, I said softly. Your granddaughter protected you. He looked down again. Do you hate me? I blinked. What? For believing her. For falling for it. For pushing you aside. I walked around the table and sat across from him. No, I said. I don't hate you. You should, he whispered. I don't, I repeated. Because I know what it's like to want to feel alive again. And she was convincing. He looked up. You're being kind. No, I said. I'm being truthful. He stared at me for a long time, then asked, so what now? Now? I said. You take long walks. Make bad jokes. Complain about Emma's taste in music. Be a grandfather. Heal. And maybe, one day, trust again. He nodded slowly. And for the first time since she was arrested, I saw the edges of him soften. He stood, walked to the door, then turned around. One more thing, he said. I raised an eyebrow. He looked straight at me. I'm sorry I didn't see her for what she was. But mostly, I'm sorry I didn't see you for what you were trying not to say. That was the moment something in me loosened. I gave him a small smile, tired but genuine. You see me now? He nodded. Then he left the way he came, quiet, gentle, no more walls. I stayed at the kitchen table long after the door closed behind him, letting that one sentence echo. Not for what it meant, but for what it finally made room for. Emma's questions. I heard Emma's door open slowly, like a whisper. I was in the kitchen again, tea in hand, rain tapping the window softly. She padded in, socks mismatched, hair unbrushed. She didn't say good morning, just sat across from me and stared at the tabletop. I waited. Silence is a language when you know how to listen. After a long pause, she said it, I ruined it. I didn't ask what. I already knew. I ruined Grandpa's wedding. I ruined the moment. I embarrassed him in front of everyone. I humiliated her. I didn't even give her a chance to explain. I sipped my tea. You didn't ruin anything, Emma. She shook her head, shoulders hunched. I thought it would feel like justice, like I did the right thing. But it didn't. It just felt bad, like I broke something that didn't belong to me. I set my cup down and looked at her. That feeling you have, that discomfort in your chest, that's called conscience. And it's not punishment. It's a gift. It means you didn't enjoy hurting someone, even when what you did was necessary. She blinked rapidly, holding something back. I just wanted to protect him. And you did, I said gently. You did what adults twice your age would have ignored. You noticed the inconsistencies. You followed the evidence. You had the courage to act when it mattered most. You weren't reckless, Emma. You were brave. But he looked so broken, Emma whispered. Like I took something from him. Like I made him old overnight. I took a breath. Sometimes truth does that. It doesn't always feel like rescue in the moment. Sometimes it feels like betrayal, especially when the truth exposes something we didn't want to see. She looked up at me. You weren't mad at me for stepping in? No, I said without pause. But I was afraid. Her eyes widened. Afraid of what? That you'd stop seeing the world as safe. That you'd start questioning the kindness of strangers. That you'd begin to carry weight I spent years learning how to hold. I stood, walked to the cabinet, and opened a small tin I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a folded page, yellowed at the corners, wrapped in protective plastic. I set it in front of her. What is this? My field notes. Estonia. 2009. She unfolded it carefully, eyes scanning the neat handwriting and coded annotations. I explained. I was stationed at a NATO facility near Tallinn. I was supposed to observe financial patterns. Routine surveillance, nothing dramatic. But something happened? I nodded. I was in a coffee shop near the port. Two men entered, one local, one American. The local man asked if the flowers had bloomed early this year. Just a casual phrase. But it wasn't spring. It was January, and it was freezing. Emma frowned. Code? Exactly, I said. They were using metaphor to signal a money transfer. Illegal, unregistered, dangerous. That one sentence unraveled an entire laundering network. It was shut down within 72 hours. Emma stared. But how did you know it wasn't just conversation? I smiled faintly. Because the man who answered mispronounced the Estonian word for no. He wasn't local. He was pretending. She exhaled. So one wrong word gave it away. Yes. Just like with Natalia or Irina. One inconsistency in the story. That's all it takes when you're listening closely. We sat quietly for a while. The rain softened. Did it feel bad? She asked. Exposing that operation? Revealing people? I looked at her. Sometimes, yes. But not because it was wrong. Because it reminded me how fragile trust is. How much damage can hide behind polite smiles. She nodded slowly. So what do I do now? I thought for a moment. You rest. You let your heart breathe. And you let time teach you what I can't. She looked down at the field note again. Do you think Grandpa hates me? No, I said. I think he hurts. But not because of you. Because he trusted someone who didn't earn it. And that's not your fault. I just wanted to keep him safe. You did, I said. And someday he'll say that out loud. Maybe not today, maybe not soon. But he will. Emma folded the note and tried to hand it back to me. No, I said, pushing it back. Keep it. Let it remain. Do you that your instincts matter? That truth has weight. And that even when it hurts, there's strength in choosing to see. She held the note with both hands. Okay. Then, almost as an afterthought, she whispered, Thanks, Mom. I blinked back something warm. No, I said. Thank you, daughter. And for the first time in weeks, she smiled. Just a little, but it was real. Justice and revenge. Emma stood by the sink, rinsing her glass. The silence between us wasn't heavy, just deliberate. She was processing again, the way she always did now, quietly, methodically, as if everything carried more weight than it used to. I watched her dry the glass and place it back in the cupboard. Then she turned. Mom, she said. Do you ever regret not stopping her earlier? Her voice was calm, but I could hear the real question underneath. Did I wait too long? Did I let it go too far? I closed the folder I'd been reading and folded my hands. Yes and no, I said. I regret what she took from your grandfather. I regret the stress, the manipulation, the money that might never be recovered. But do I regret the timing of when she was stopped? I looked her in the eye. No. Because if I had acted on my own, without proof, without patience, without letting her show her true nature, I would have made myself the villain in someone else's story. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. But you knew way before everyone else. Doesn't that make it feel like you could have prevented more damage? I nodded slowly. It does. That's the burden of seeing clearly before others do. But there's a line, Emma. A very thin line between revenge and justice. She tilted her head, listening. Revenge, I continued, is about release. About satisfying our own pain by watching someone else fall. It feels urgent, almost addictive. But justice is different. It waits. It watches. It builds its case. Not just to punish, but to protect. She was quiet for a while, then asked, "So you weren't angry?" "Oh, I was furious," I said with a soft laugh. "Not just for your grandfather, but for how easily someone like her could lie with a smile. But if I had acted on that anger, if I had gone to the authorities too soon or tried to confront her without what we gathered, she would have twisted the narrative. I would have lost your grandfather, Emma. Completely. He would have chosen to believe her, and we'd be standing on opposite sides of a battlefield I never wanted." She exhaled through her nose. "That sounds hard." It was, I admitted. But sometimes doing the right thing means enduring the wrong moments first. She came over and sat beside me at the table, her face more solemn than I liked seeing on a 12-year-old. "So what if she never slipped up? What if we never found that recording?" I looked at her. "Then we would have kept watching, learning, waiting. And maybe eventually she would have exposed herself another way. Or maybe we'd have lost that battle. That's the risk of choosing justice over revenge. It doesn't guarantee satisfaction, just integrity." She rubbed at a spot on the table with her thumb. "But it's slower. And harder." "Yes," I said. "But it also lasts longer. It repairs instead of destroys. Revenge makes the moment feel good. Justice makes a lifetime safer." Emma looked at me, voice low. I didn't want to be angry. I just didn't want her to fool Grandpa anymore. "And you didn't act out of anger," I told her. "You acted because you saw the truth and knew it couldn't stay hidden. That's not revenge. That's courage." She nodded. Then, after a pause, asked, "Do you think I could have waited longer?" I thought about it. Maybe. But you made the best decision you could with the information you had. And it was enough. You didn't ruin anything, Emma. You helped stop a dangerous person from continuing her cycle." I touched her hand. "And more importantly, you learned the hardest lesson some adults never do, that truth without timing can be a weapon, but truth with wisdom." She finished the thought softly, "It's justice." We sat there, the kitchen still except for the hum of the refrigerator. "You're growing up fast," I whispered. "Feels strange," she muttered. "It always does," I said. "But trust me, you're not alone. And I'm proud of how you handled everything." She gave a small smile, then leaned her head on my shoulder. And in that quiet, I knew some battles don't end with applause. They end with understanding, passed from mother to daughter, like a torch lit in the dark. 1 year later. It had been a year. 12 quiet months, and yet they moved like tides, subtle but full of change. My father started laughing again. Not the hollow kind, the polite chuckle he used to carry like borrowed clothing, too large for his frame, too stiff to feel like his. No, this time it came from somewhere deeper. Real. He started returning to the community center. They invited him to lead their Friday chess group. He'd smile, shake his head, pretend to decline, then show up anyway, board under one arm like some old medal. He even received a community volunteer award in April. He didn't display it prominently, but I saw the folded certificate tucked behind books on his shelf, right next to Mom's old gardening journals. Emma visited him every other weekend. She didn't say much when she came home, but I could tell she no longer flinched when I mentioned Grandpa. They had their own quiet rhythm now, as if something had reset. Or maybe something genuine was finally allowed to grow. I don't know when Emma St. Artade learning Mandarin. I just found a workbook in her backpack, Mandarin for Beginners. There were sticky notes on the pages with phrases like "What do you remember?" and "Tell me again." She never explained it. I never asked. But I understood. Maybe she wanted to reclaim something. Maybe she wanted to understand what Irina really said in that recording, beyond the arrest, beyond the moment that stole her innocence too soon. Maybe this was her way of ensuring that language couldn't deceive them again. That truth, if spoken, would always be understood. And as for me, I started sleeping through the night again. It's strange, the things you only realize when they return. I no longer jolted awake at 2 a.m. with that old instinct, that feeling like something was slipping through my fingers, like I was too late, always too late. That constant loop had quieted. One morning, I woke to the sound of birds. I stayed in bed an extra 10 minutes. That was the moment I knew I'd forgiven myself. Not for failing to see, because I did see. Not for speaking late, because it was exactly when I needed to speak. But for carrying the weight of two people, for thinking I had to protect everyone. At dinner one night, my father brought dessert, tiramisu from the same Italian place Mom used to love. He said it tasted almost right. I looked up, and for the first time in years, there wasn't guilt behind his eyes. Just time. Time had passed, and we were still here. I told him Emma was learning Mandarin. He laughed. Really laughed. So she can interrogate future partners? Maybe, I smiled. Or maybe she just wants to speak your language. All of it. That made him pause, just for a second. Then he nodded and said, I'll speak back. There were still days he didn't talk much. Days when I'd find him on the porch, holding Mom's mug, now empty, tracing the rim with his thumb. But those days were no longer surrounded by silence. They were part of something fuller, like pauses in a song, not the end of one. I finally let myself hang new pictures. One of Emma at the science fair. One of my parents holding hands in Yellowstone back in '94, when life was all denim and sunlight. And one from last month, the three of us, Dad, Emma, and I, at the farmer's market. We're not quite smiling, but we're not pretending either. We're just together. And that counts. I didn't realize how deeply I had doubted myself until that doubt eased. Until the whisper in my chest changed from "you should have stopped it sooner" to "you did what you could, with love and with precision." I was a daughter, a mother, and once, briefly, a soldier again. Not with weapons or ranks this time, but with discernment, with patience. I didn't destroy Irina. She did that to herself. All I did was wait until the truth could be seen without needing to shout. That's harder than people think. Harder th. And revenge, harder than conventional justice. It's faith. And I don't use that word lightly. But sometimes the most profound act of love is to say, I see what's coming, and I will still let you walk toward it. Not because I don't care, but because I believe you need to see it for yourself. My father needed to see. And he did. Now he brings tomatoes from his garden. He makes small jokes. He asks if Emma's growing taller than me. He remembers to check the mail. And every time he does, I remind myself, healing doesn't knock. It just enters quietly. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it brings tiramisu. The letter. The letter came on a Tuesday. It was in a plain white envelope, the kind you could mistake for a bill or neighborhood flyer. But the seal in the corner, dark blue, stamped with gold, told me it was something else. FBI. International Operations Division. I didn't open it right away. I left it on the counter while I finished rinsing dishes, while I folded laundry, while I picked Emma up from school. Something about it felt weighted even before I tore it open. When I finally did, the words were simple. On behalf of our Operations Division, we extend our gratitude to you, Ms. Chen, for your role in exposing the transnational laundering network tied to Irina Valenko. Your discretion and professionalism directly aided in dismantling one of the more elusive criminal frameworks in recent years. Her conviction, 14 years federal sentence, stands as a result of coordinated effort. Please know your vigilance prevented further harm. With respect. FBI International Operations. I read it twice, then a third time. My fingers lingered on the word gratitude. Gratitude for a wedding that turned into an arrest. For a child's courage. For silence turned into proof. But when I folded the letter and set it down, I didn't feel triumphant. Not really. Because the sentence, the 14 years, none of that mattered to me the way it probably should have. What I remembered most wasn't the courtroom, or the reporters, or even the federal agents acknowledging my assistance. It was that single moment, Emma standing in the middle of the chapel, voice shaking, holding a black recorder like it was the only weapon she would ever need. "Grandfather, don't marry her." The sound of her saying that still lives in my chest. I can replay it word for word, tone for tone. I can still see the way the guests froze, how my father's hands gripped the chair, how Irina's perfect smile fractured. That was the moment the lie ended. Not when the FBI secured her. Not when the gavel struck. It ended because a child spoke truth in a room full of adults too polite, too afraid, or too blind to do it themselves. I told Emma once that courage doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it just looks like standing up. She didn't believe me at the time. But I think she does now. When I showed her the letter, she read it carefully. She even smiled a little. But then she said, "They should have written my name." I laughed softly. Maybe one day they will. But between us, I knew the truth. Her name didn't need to be written. It was already etched into the story that changed everything. My father has never forgotten it. He still tells the story to his chess group, though he changes the details every time. Sometimes he says Emma outsmarted the bride. Other times he says Emma intercepted a code. The stories shift, but the pride never does. For me, though, pride is mixed with something heavier. Every time I remember that day, I think of what could have happened if Emma hadn't acted. If the recording had stayed hidden. If Irina had succeeded. 14 years in prison feels like a number. It doesn't carry the weight of what almost was, the destruction she nearly brought into our family. That's why I keep the recorder in a drawer, tucked away but never forgotten. Not as evidence anymore, but as a reminder. Because justice isn't the trial. Justice isn't the years marked on a judge's sheet. Justice is a child refusing to let silence win. That letter from the FBI is still on my desk. I haven't framed it. I haven't filed it away. It sits loose, vulnerable, like the truth it represents. When people ask me how I feel now that it's over, I give them the same answer every time. It's not over. It never really is. Because the lesson doesn't end with her prison term. The lesson is that harm wears a smile. And sometimes only a child is willing to say that smile isn't real. One night, Emma came into the living room while I was rereading the letter. She sat next to me, swinging her legs, and asked, "Do you think she ever thinks about us in there?" I looked at her. Maybe. But that doesn't matter. What matters is we think about us, not her. She leaned into me, resting her head against my shoulder. "I didn't mean to be brave," she whispered. "I know," I said. That's what made it real. Outside, the night was quiet. No applause, no headlines. Just a family sitting together, alive, safe, still learning how to breathe again. And as I folded the letter back into its envelope, I realized something. History would remember Irina Valenko for her crimes. The FBI would remember me for my service. But I would remember my daughter standing in that chapel, saying words that shattered the lie. And the world had no choice but to listen. The lake. The lake shimmered under the soft light of late spring. It was a place we hadn't visited in years, one of those quiet corners on the edge of town where trees bent low to whisper over the water and the world felt smaller, softer, slower. I used to come here as a girl, alone with my journal and silence. Now I came with Emma. We didn't talk at first. My father was a few steps away, crouched by a portable grill, humming tunelessly as he sliced bread into even pieces. He had brought salted butter and a jar of strawberry preserves, things that felt impossibly simple after the kind of year we'd had. But maybe that was the point. Emma sat cross-legged beside me, picking pebbles from the shore and stacking them in deliberate piles. Her hair was longer now, and her hands looked slightly bigger. But it wasn't her appearance that struck me. It was the way she sat, shoulders straight, eyes scanning, not like a child lost in daydreams, but like someone who had seen too much too soon. She didn't speak until the third stack of pebbles. If I meet someone like her again someday, she asked without looking at me, should I stay quiet? I turned toward her, watching her face. Her expression was calm, but behind her voice was something I recognized. Not fear, not guilt, but the weight of understanding. The burden of knowing what people are capable of. No, I said gently. But you should wait for the right moment. You should do it the right way. And you need proof. She looked at me then, eyes searching for the why. Because when you speak truth without proof, I continued, they'll call it gossip. Or bitterness. Or jealousy. People don't like hearing things that make them uncomfortable. Even if you're right. Especially if you're right. She nodded slowly. What if they get hurt while I'm waiting? My chest tightened. It was the question I had asked myself 100 times, in a dozen countries, in rooms filled with threats disguised as charm. You don't wait out of cowardice, I said. You wait to make sure that when you speak, the lie can't slip away. The grill behind us clicked, and the smell of crisping bread drifted through the breeze. My father called out, hot and ready. Not burned, for once. Emma smiled faintly but didn't move. Her hands were still. She whispered, I didn't feel brave that day. I reached out and took her hand, warm and dry with lake dust. That's what made it brave, I said. It's not courage if you're not scared. She leaned against me then, not like a child needing protection, but like someone sharing space, sharing silence, the kind of closeness that didn't need words to make it real. We sat that way until my father wandered over, handing us toasted slices with a grin. Butter and jam, courtesy of an old man who used to trust the wrong people. I took the bread, met his eyes. There was humor in his voice, but no bitterness left. Just a tired kind of wisdom, the kind only gained after the ground shifts under you and you somehow keep standing. As he sat beside us, the three of us looking out at the lake, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not release, not closure, those re-tidy words for untidy truths. But maybe peace. A version of it. The world hadn't returned to what it was. It never would. But we were still here, together. And maybe that was enough. When Emma finished her bread, she asked, is that why you didn't stop her earlier? Because you were waiting for the right time? I didn't lie to her. Yes. And because I wasn't sure your grandfather could accept it from me. He needed to see it himself. She looked at the rippling water, then said, I think I understand that now. But it still hurts sometimes, thinking about it. I wrapped my arm around her shoulder. Some truths hurt before they heal, I said. But silence can scar worse. She nodded again. She didn't need to say more. Above us, birds moved across the sky in slow arcs. The air carried the scent of pine and baked sugar, and the water lapped softly against the stones. In that moment, I realized something else. I hadn't failed her. Not as a mother, not as a daughter, not even as a woman who once stayed quiet longer than she should have. Because the child beside me, she wasn't broken. She was awake. Thoughtful. Stronger than I had been at her age. And she knew something most adults still struggle with, that telling the truth is not about being loud. It's about being right, and being ready. And when the time comes, you don't shout. You speak just loud enough for the world to hear. The stillness. There's a certain silence that follows storms. Not emptiness, but the kind of stillness that means something has passed and something else can begin. That's what I felt exactly 1 year after it all unfolded. Not triumph, not vindication, but stillness. I sat on the back porch of our house, legs tucked beneath me, a blanket around my shoulders though it wasn't cold. Emma was inside finishing homework. My father had fallen asleep on the couch with a book on his chest and a glass of unfinished tea nearby. And I was simply breathing. It had taken years to learn how to do that again without the weight of what-ifs. What if I had spoken too soon? What if I had waited too long? What if Emma had never stood up? But those questions no longer haunted me, because I had my answers. All of them. When I looked back on everything, from suspicion to pain to revelation, I didn't see a battle won through fury or force. I saw a small device hidden in a child's pocket. I saw the way Emma had stood and spoken, even when her voice trembled. I saw restraint instead of rage, patience instead of panic. That was the victory. Not exposing Irina, but protecting Emma's ability to trust again. You see, in all my years of military training, nobody ever taught me the most dangerous form of destruction: what happens quietly, when the wrong person earns your belief. Irina hadn't broken into our home with a weapon. She had entered with warmth, with charm, with lies wrapped in attractive words. And if I had confronted or before I had proof, she would have survived it, twisted it, maybe even turned my father or Emma against me. But I didn't. Because I had learned, both in war zones and family dinners, that sometimes the strongest defense is silence, strategic, unshaken, waiting not for the enemy to fall, but for the mask to slip on its own. And it had. Irina's conviction had come down 2 months ago, 14 years in federal prison. No parole for the first 8. Her financial crimes, stretching across 5 countries, had finally caught up with her. But I didn't feel elation when the news arrived. I felt a quiet, solemn kind of relief. A week later, the letter came from the FBI, typed, formal, but oddly sincere. They thanked me for my discreet support in identifying a Tier 2 transnational laundering network. They praised the clarity of Emma's recorded audio. They enclosed a note about how her courage played a key role in validating the investigation timeline. I kept that letter in a drawer, not because I needed the recognition, but because one day, when Emma is older, she might need to remember that even the smallest voices can change the course of something enormous. But if I had to choose one moment to hold on to forever, one memory that defines this entire chapter of our lives, it wouldn't be that courtroom, or the headlines, or the prison sentence. It would be the moment Emma stood. When she placed her small hands on that recorder, cleared her throat, and said, "She's lying." The air had gone still. The guests had stared. My father had turned pale. And Emma, my Emma, had not run. That's the real ending. Not the fall of a criminal, but the rise of a child who found her voice. And as for me, I learned finally that being a soldier had never made me brave. Being a mother did. Because soldiers are trained to fight battles. But mothers, we must choose which ones matter, and when to wait. That night on the porch, I closed my eyes and whispered words I never said aloud during the whole ordeal. Words that aren't flashy or heroic, but that feel like truth. Victory isn't when you expose the villain. It's when you protect the ones you love from the kind of hurt that lingers long after the threat is gone. That was my mission. Not revenge, not justice in the papers, but safeguarding Emma's softness, her hope, her ability to look at the world and still believe in something better. And now, before this story fades behind the next, I want to say something. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care.